Okay. So the topic today basically looks at rail freight service performance and the issues of service reliability. Carl Martland started this work, or I should say focused. I imagine railroad's been looking at this for a while, but focused his work in the 1970s with some funding from the FRA, which was newly formed at the time, and there was research money to look into why railroads could not provide reliable service. So this is kind of a current view of something that Carl started 50 years ago. And we'll see if anybody notices any significant improvement. So what approaches have railroaders tried to address unreliability? Everybody sees the next screen?
No.
No?
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Oh, I think I need to do, sorry, let me. Okay. Yeah. I'll maybe share. There we go. That should be it. Okay, so you seeing a new screen?
There you go. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the question is, what approaches have railroaders tried to address unreliability over the years? So this is an approach that the Pennsylvania Railroad used in probably the 40s. The point is the railroads have long known how to fix unreliable service, and that is they keep the cars moving. So don't stand me still. I guess there's 2 points I would make here. One is that this car is obviously sitting in the yard. And secondly, the Pennsylvania Railroad was apparently not completely successful in doing that as they went out of business in 1968. For our younger viewers, I'll point out the color stripes that you see on the side of this car. The railroads are not always known to be technology leaders, but in the 70s, the decision was made that there was so much clerical work that needed to be automated. Railroads came up with this automatic car identification, ACI. So you had to see that colored stripe. And before lasers and all kinds of new technologies in an environment that's extremely dirty, the thought was that you could go buy a rail car or a rail car would go buy a scanner, and a scanner could read that at track speed. If you think about how we look at our grocery store experience when we want to scan an item in a perfectly clear or clean environment with new technology, you frequently have to scan several times. So this was definitely an optimistic view. So if they achieved it, then they could brag by saying that they had a service that was siding to siding dependably. This is a B&O had a Sentinel service, and they provided a more reliable service at some level of commitment. I'm not saying they ever necessarily gave anybody money back, but the focus was that they would move cars, LCL cars, less than carload, within their network, and they had people that would monitor how these cars moved across the system. what I think is kind of amazing, considering how much of a challenge it is for a single railroad to provide reliable service. Starting in 1931, there was an effort by smaller railroads to compete with the big guys. The New York Central, the Pennsylvania, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Erie Railroad all went from eastern points to Chicago, and some of those also went to St. Louis. So it was probably quite a leap of faith that 8 railroads could coordinate service across their systems. So they operate 2 trains a day. The analysis I read is that the transit time was about 10 hours longer than a competition, but apparently reliability was adequate to be competitive. So the point here is that 8 railroads somehow could coordinate as well as a single railroad seemed to be able to do, which is quite a feat. So the question then is there a railroad reliability problem? So courtesy of Carl Martland, one of his studies in the mid-1970s looked at trip time distribution for boxcars originating in Illinois and terminating in Indiana, 217 miles. And even then, with more frequent, smaller trains and so on, the service is quite unreliable with a long tail. Remarkably, some cars can make it in 2 days. The average, the standard that was set was 5 days. The average was 5.7. And now you start looking at the statistics. So you have an on time or early of 60% and no more than 1 day late of 80%. I'll add that I was once in a meeting where there was a discussion about trip time performance. It was Kellogg, and they had surveyed their customers, and the customers were asked, what is it that Kellogg could do better? And one of the things that was pointed out was that they couldn't deliver. They didn't deliver on their commitments. They looked to see if they were the largest user of rail among the serial companies, and at that point, they pretty quickly moved over to trucking. So this kind of thing obviously has been a thorn in the railroad side for a long time. So that's mid-1970s. So what's a more recent look like? Okay, this again from Carl Martland. Typical trip time distribution. Railroad-owned gondolas, 227 moves, no constructed placement, so there's no time in there in this spread. 2 intermediate class yards, so there's plenty of opportunity for misconnections and added time. 8.5 day average, and so you can see 3 days is about 60%, and what's it, 11 days or so is 90 percentile. So this is 2006, and I don't have any reason to believe anything has gotten any better. One of the things that I think should be of concern to railroads is that there are customers that have, let's say, a 2-car industry track. And so they have a supplier, and the supplier is supposed to release 2 cars a day. Railroads, in my experience, can seldom keep those 2 cars together in some fashion. So the customer will get no cars some days, 1 car some days, and 5 cars some days. And when it's 5 cars, and now they're paying demurrage and they have to do constructive placement and so on. So it's not only just the transit time issues, it's also the fact that if you have constrained capacity for unloading, there's really no way for the shipper to be able to plan to move to stock reliably. So that was 1970s, then it was 2000s. Well, surely by this time it's better. Well, let's look at the book. And that book would be Hunter Harrison's How We Work and Why. So this was the basic principles of precision scheduled railroading, PSR. So we'll talk about each of these things in detail, but let's just quickly say minimize car dwell, minimize car classification, don't stop when you don't have to, run as many trains a day as possible to handle multiple departures of the block, run general purpose trains, and you don't hear too much of balanced train movements by direction. I think that was an initial effort, but that was an idea that you depart a train from the west to east and from the east to the west, they meet and swap crews, and now you have the crews home and you're not paying hotel or away from home charges. Minimize power requirements and strive for a steady workflow. Now, one of the things that I'd like to point out here is there is no place where it says run long trains. And pretty much in my view, that's my opinion, but I don't know how much of any of these principles are actually exercised today, but we do run long trains. And run long trains actually is the opposite of using multiple traffic outlets. I would also argue, I have not simulated, I'd also argue that running a big train with multiple units, 5 or 6 units, the power arrives in big chunks instead of a lot of small chunks. And I would actually say the power requirements might go up as you run bigger but fewer trains. So let's look at each one of those principles. Move large blocks as soon as possible. Focus on incoming cars with tightest connection. The idea here is what people call hump yard arrival sequencing, hump yard sequencing, and where if you have 2 trains have come in, there's a departing train in 12 hours and departing train in 20 hours, then focus on what cars need to go to the one in 12 hours and prioritize that cut of cars. And so you switch one of the 2 because it has more cars that need to make that outbound train. One of the big issues here is focus on the network. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges on the railroad. We incentivize everyone to look locally. So the idea is that you try to make things good for your yard because that's what you get paid for. That's what you get yelled at if you do a poor job. It's tough to focus on the network when you have these incentives not to focus on the network. If you can slip a couple of cars in for someone else to switch down the line because you're congested, well, you do that. And regrettably, I don't think we really have the tools today to look at how a local decision affects the network as a whole. So minimize car classification, that's pretty obvious. This is something that every network model has addressed for, since certainly 1980s. You look at where cars come from, and then you look to see where you can most efficiently switch those cars, where you can have large enough blocks to go as far as possible, and try to block as close to origin as possible. The issue here is there's always a trade-off. What opportunity the network has that work should be done in a particular yard, versus the fact that that yard may not really be designed to handle as many blocks as the system would like. So there's this balance between what you'd like and sort of what you can do. So this, to me, is kind of an important focus. We have, it's typical in my experience that a train is run once a day. I can't speak for BNSF today, but when I worked there, the only train that was handled twice a day was Kansas City to Barstow and Barstow to Kansas City. So in that entire network, there was not any other trains that were handled more than once a day. BNSF also had a policy which was interesting. They decided that there were opportunities to pre-block deeper into the system, but there wasn't enough volume every day. And so as a consequence, they would run, say, a train every other day once volume increased. So there are those that would say, okay, you're holding cars then to get further into the system. It's creating yard congestion and so on. So, again, there's always a balance between the different ideas. So the basic idea here is there any way that you can put enough volume together at one location so you can run 2 trains a day instead of 1 train a day out of each yard? And I have an example here from my Grand Trunk days. So at the Grand Trunk, we had interchange from Conrail, CSX, and NS in Toledo. We had a Lang yard in Toledo that was the Grand Trunks. And we also had a yard at Flat Rock, which is south of Detroit. And it was a modest size hump. Lang yard was also a hump yard. So in the initial plan here, you see that Conrail and NS traffic is now coming into Flat Rock Yard. And those volumes were low enough, people weren't too concerned about the volume, about impacting the yard performance. CSX train was 100 cars a day roughly. And so the concern was that would overload Flat Rock. Lang yard, as I say, was a hump yard. Pretty silly. It basically handled this traffic. I imagine it handled some, local distribution as well. But the CSX train was 100 cars a day, and they paid a footboard yardmaster, which is a conductor, to run the hump for these 100 cars a day. In any case, the result was that you had 1 train a day that went to Detroit and the rest of the Grand Trunk system. And you had 1 train a day that came from Lang Yard, went to Detroit and the rest of the Grand Trunk system. So the improved plan, which we developed using the automated blocking model that was developed in, I believe, 1984, we looked at what happens if we move the traffic, the CSX traffic into Flat Rock. Well, the initial concern was that Flat Rock would not be able to handle additional 100 cars a day. But the point was that with the sufficient volume that's now accumulated in Flat Rock, you could run 2 trains a day out of Flat Rock. And when I looked at this, I found that in the initial plan, because there was only 1 train a day, there are a minimum of 40 cars continuously at Flat Rock that couldn't get out because there was 1 train a day. So there was a steady level of 40 cars just sitting there for the next train. Now they were empties, multi-levels, auto parts, and so on. So they weren't critical for service, but I believe it's Rule 22. If you can advance the cars to a point where they're holding for industry spot, you can start reclaiming the time. So in any case, what we're able to do is basically move from the left to the right. And what ended up happening was we made Flat Rock far more fluid. And we were able to basically close Lang Yard for anything that was merchandise related, again, except for perhaps local traffic. So the focus of this general purpose trains, if we look back up to the 1960s, almost everything moved in general merchandise. So you'd have coal and grain as well as merchandise in your mix. The beauty of that was you now had enough volume that you could justify running multiple trains a day because you had sufficient volume to justify it. Well, in the 60s, the unit train was invented. And so now we start taking major pieces of traffic out of this general network mix. As a consequence, you now have fewer cars and fewer opportunities to make multiple trains and the like. So the idea here is, unless unit trains are specifically justified, it's better to try to leave those things in general merchandise. And I would say there are definitely indications that this part of PSR has been adopted, because you will see trains with very mixed consists that maybe once would have been in dedicated service. And again, that gives you the opportunity to not only move those cars, hopefully well, but also move other cars along with it that got a poor ride previously. So the relevant measures here: car velocity, trip plan compliance on time, train performance, locomotive productivity, and labor productivity. So those are, well-known, established measures of how railroad is operating. So this is my take on why we're not even close. And that is, there's so much randomness in freight railroading. There's resource shortages. We didn't have enough locomotives. We didn't have big enough crew base. Obviously, we have equipment failures. And even if we had crews, they're out for sick leave and vacations. Obviously, weather events. Don't know how many people know there are weather plans, for example, that can be triggered if Chicago is snowed in. Railroads automatically divert traffic, interchange traffic to Memphis and points in the south. just to avoid having to try to operate in a bad Chicago winter. There's accidents, derailments, congestion in the road and yard. And one of the things that's often overlooked, and that is we have no idea what traffic we're going to have. We take cars out to industry, but we don't know exactly when we'll get them back. And it's improved a bit, but pretty much we're not too far from, we have cars coming from X railroad because I see the headlight. There's no planning as to what's coming your way. And Marty and I worked on trying to crack that nut while I worked at BNSF. So a lot of people beat their chest about being a Six Sigma business. The railroads are definitely not Six Sigma businesses, and yet our planning processes and our models treat it as one. I'm not going to state authoritatively that this is the case, but one industrial engineer told me that railroads are a half Sigma business. So I've got a simple model here that I think provides a more realistic view of North American freight railroading in practice. And again, this goes back to approaches that Carl Martland developed in the 70s and 80s. So let's look quickly at how a trip plan is calculated. You have a release event or an interchange receipt, and that starts the creation of a trip plan. A trip plan is a stated plan that says this car will arrive at this time and on this day. So we have this opening event, the trains arrive in the first yard, let's say at noon, and if it's 12-hour processing time, then we'd expect that car to be available at midnight. Then we look for what train's available after midnight, at midnight or after. We park for next yard, repeat arrival processing, time departure. On arrival at final serving yard, we add terminating time to arrival time. Now, I highlight terminating time because there's a break between what service design planners at a network level do and what local people do. And what happens once it gets into a yard to be distributed to another railroad or to industry is not really part of the trip plan. You just put a plug time in of assuming 12 hours or 24 or whatever. And one of the things that I hope that the local people take the operating plan that the division, that the network, the service designers come up with and arrange their local plan to best handle the cars that come in. But all that is in local control and not in any kind of service design function. And if the car deviates from plan, you calculate a new trip plan. And it's one thing for our trip plans to do this, but our network models do the same thing. Okay, so quick look at how this looks. So we've got release, we arrived initial yard, there's a series of intermediate yards, and then we arrived at the final yard. So let's say the processing time is 12 hours, and train 1 is departing in 11 hours, and train 2 is departing in 20 hours. So according to our logic, if it's 12-hour processing time, we only have 11 hours, then clearly this car is not going to make this train. So it's going to fall to the train that's 20 hours later. Well, anyone who's worked in a yard knows that on a good day, 50% of cars will make the 11-hour train 1, and that even with 20 hours, maybe only 90% of the available cars will actually make train 2. So even when we look at this, you can see that this is such a simple view of the world, because probabilistically, it's not absolutely 100% are going to make train 2, and absolutely none are going to make train 1. So that's kind of the focus of what my presentation is. Again, you see we add terminating time. So you can see that is not as sophisticated as arrive at initial yard. There's no specific connection to a specific train. Now, this was always the way I knew trip plans to be. Certainly in the time since I retired, somebody might have done a better integrated that. So this kind of brings up a little question of what the heck does even a trip transit time standard mean? If you're going to sit down with a customer, you're going to go in and you say, oh, well, our trip plan says it should be there in 120 hours. Well, that's not really giving the guy very much information. So the point here is don't promise the trip will take 140 hours. Just say the trip will be completed within 7 days, more than 90% of the time, and we'll let you know well in advance if the car is delayed. So if we were honest and we were motivated to do it, it should be any trip plan that we discuss with customers should be based on the probability we'll make it. So, you know, better than saying it's 140 hours, say it's 168 hours with 90% probability, and then he can plan around that. If he gets there early, that's okay. So here's another view of it. If we have this distribution, meet or exceed original trip plan of 120 hours, only 26% make it. Maximum 48-hour percentage, how many make it within 48 hours? It's 83%. Or the green one, percent within expected time plus 24 hours is 97. So the question even is, what does a trip standard mean? So let me show what the screen is that is viewed when this model runs. It's a very simple network model. This is not intended to be any kind of a system for real-time planning. It's really to get a sense as to what policies and what factors most directly affect performance. So what we see here is 4 yards. All traffic originates here because, again, I'm making up numbers and there's no sense in having traffic originating over here. I try to keep it simple. So all the traffic originates here and moves to the right. There's no traffic moving from right to left. What we see here is this is the number of cars at this time in the model that are in yard A, 327 cars. 249 cars, this is a ridiculously long train, are moving train AB1 of day 5 on this block and this number of cars. At yard B, we have 30 cars in the yard that are waiting to be terminated to industry or local or interchange. And then 156 cars here and so on. Here we see what settings we have. So we've got 12 hours, but our yard reliability is only 85% for this particular run. And here I'm running one train and I just block to the next yard. So A mine runs cars to B, B takes their cars out, mine runs it to C, and so on. I'm told I worked for the Illinois Central Gulf back in the 70s and the Gulf Mobile in Ohio. was a pretty simple railroad, and I understand they pretty much did this. They didn't, the blocking plan was just move it to the next place and let them switch it all over again. So in any case, so here's all the train arrivals and departures that have happened recently. And then down here, you start seeing, this is the yard A dwell, and this is a trip time for A to B, A to C, and A to D. These change as time goes on. You can see 209 cars have terminated here, 107 and 25. So basically, not many train cars have gotten through to yard D in this model. So again, just a quick summary, it's left to right flow. There's 300 cars. They arrive at 5 different times a day, not 300 every time. Total of 300 arrive over 5 times. Cars terminated 3 times. Performance parameters are identical for all yards. I have a midweek origination that's 15% higher. 8-hour travel time, 20 yards, 1 hour dwell at each yard. I have a warm up, and then I have a shutdown process. Each yard terminates the same volume of traffic. Yard processing is 12 hours. Process cars make connections 100% time. There's no train size limit set. That's the default settings. If you don't change your change from the default. So here's the kinds of things that we can look at. We can change the parameters, the number, the length of the processing time, reliability, train size, maximums and minima. And also we can introduce a triangular distribution so that we don't always get either 12 or 18, but we might get 11 and 13, which is more realistic. And we have an operating plan where we can do multiple daily departures versus a daily departure. And we can do a direct destination block versus intermediate classifications. We can also do block swaps and the like. So here's a snapshot of 3 trains, or 3 operating plans, I should say. I did not change the parameters of the yards, but this gives you a little sense well, actually, I did change the parameters, I'm sorry. So the top one is 12 hours, 100% reliability. The middle one is 12 hours and 85% reliability. That means that 85% of the cars that are available will actually make the outbound train in 12 hours. Well, I should say if they're available beyond 12 hours. And then the bottom one is the yard is really congested and the processing time goes up to 18 hours, and obviously it would be a very unreliable yard at that point. So processing time, I found, I talked with a railroad service planner. Processing time specified most yards vary between 10 and 14, but congested yards might spike to 18 hours or more, producing long dwell times. So in any case, the basic point is the shape of the curve is quite different. This is the average in each case, and you can see that obviously it becomes less reliable, and it gets, the average transit time is shifting to the right. This one is basically changing the operating plan. So at the top, we have a trip time for 1 train a day that runs with 2 intermediate switches en route. So the service level is quite bad. Now, this assumes 100% reliability. So if this were 85% reliability with multiple intermediate classifications, it would be quite bad. The curves would look far worse. So here's it. Let's say the customer is not satisfied with this trip plan performance, and so the railroad runs 2 trains from yard A to D and creates a direct yard A to D block, assuming that yard A has a capacity. Resulting trip time is shown here. And let's say, okay, well, we've decided to do that, but I'm not going to run any train under 125 cars. So you see here that you still start at the same point, but the actual delivered service is quite different. Now this is distorted because I have just one traffic source. So when the train leaves from A going to B, it's adequate size, but when it gets to B, it drops off enough cars that it's under the required, the minimum train size, and as a consequence, cars, it has to wait until the next train arrives, and then it departs with 125 cars. Obviously, if you had intermediate traffic from B, C, and D, from B and C to D, it wouldn't be quite as distorted. So here's my the summary is that railroads have not made measurable progress in improving service reliability. And in my view, implementation of PSR and longer trains has had an adverse effect as a primary focus is cost reduction. Anybody who's a student of railroading knows that there's a run at NS, proxy fight. I think it'll come to fruition tomorrow at the meeting. And it's basically about who can implement PSR better. I don't want to comment on the validity, but basically it's I can do it better than you can, and time will tell. So there are one of the things that's been kind of amazing, and all the stuff that is frequently talked about service design meetings, and at you know, in what was in Hunter Harrison's book, there's nothing about improving yard processes. They're not about making them more reliable. There's nothing about trying to minimize or have a system to help cut the process time. So it's only recently that there's been a focus on improving yard processes. There's a company called Cedar AI, and it developed something called OptiSwitch, which basically takes the railroad, the rail yard inventory, takes in the desired outcome, and comes up with an AI generated switch list that has been shown to outperform other yard masters. And Wabtec is also developing a yard planner. I should say Cedar AI's focus is mostly on flat yards. Wabtec has a hump yard, and I believe they're perhaps working on a flat yard planner as well. In my view, trip times need to be expressed in terms of probability to deliver within a certain probability on a certain day. And the absence of multi-railroad trip planning systems obscures the service the customer sees. There was an effort probably in the 1990s to integrate the systems, at least have them talk to one another so that you could get a trip plan across multiple railroads. That was found to be difficult because each railroad had its own assumptions and its own processes, and unfortunately it was abandoned. So nobody can really see how bad or good, let's say, the service actually is. So that's the end of my presentation. If there's any questions, there's my email address. And I'm open to questions.
Thanks, Roger, for this interesting presentation. So we do have a list of questions in the chat, and I think also a bit of the discussions of the questions. So we have questions from Martin that's about the page 4.
Okay, I can do this again. Share this going.
Yes.
And gotta go back. Oh, boy. Oh, there. Okay.
Just wonder what happened that have the car that for 2 days, and that it seems to happen more than once.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, tell me when I'm at the right. This one or Marty?
That was more a comment than a question. I'm used to seeing large right-hand tails of transit time distributions, and I think this is a really good representative distribution. The remark that I made was to wonder about the circumstances that led to several shipments observed with 2-day transits when the mode here is 5.
Right. It's a. I mean, I guess that just emphasized the randomness.
Yeah.
If did I hit every traffic light green? Versus some traffic lights were red and some were green. And
Exactly.
Which I mean, how do you present that to a customer?
And it's a good illustration of the fact that some tactical actions that are taken in railroad management are beneficial to some traffic when they happen. The net effect of them all is this distribution. But occasionally you'll have one that is beneficial.
I would say that there's been talk for a long time about having capacitated trip plans, and what you would do was you'd look at the traffic and decide what traffic needed to be handled today and what traffic could wait based on some kind of a trip standard. And so that car at 2 days, it might still get there in 2 days, but not at the expense of something else suffering and missing its plan. I have no idea how close we are to any kind of capacitated system, but that's long been talked about.
Yes, including by us. There's always sort of a bridge too far. There were other more straightforward ideas that people wanted to try before doing the quite sophisticated programming necessary to put capacitation on a trip planner. It raises then too to the business question of whether this representation of performance, even if we're representing it honestly, is something that the railroad feels that it can defend and sell, and whether customers with eyes open can accept. And I think that there's always been a dirty little secret aspect to this.
Well, I would argue that you basically do what was presented later was 80% within this time and not get into the ugly fact that it's going to be pretty random up to then.
Yes.
Right.
Any other question?
Yes, so we have questions, list questions. Sora asked about question of how about the reliability of other modes? If there's some other modes are more expensive and more reliable compared with railway. And I think Martin helped to answer that as well. But
Well,
if
let me just
Roger's
say
happy.
make a quick comment. I feel sorry for real customers. You the whole process of ordering and the like, and monitoring, and and the train coming out to pick up your set out and empty, and then come back 2 days later and pick up the load, and then all the coordination takes to move a rail car out of sight, let's say, is so much tougher than, I know what, I'll call a trucking company. They'll have a truck driver come out with his trailer. He might stay there and load the trailer. So after that, I'm done. That guy has the incentive to get that truck across the country. I might get intermediate reports that he's in Indiana or whatever. He might update me if he's going to miss some basic plan, but he is personally incentivized. And there is no rail car that's personally incentivized. And it's just, it's just a market condition that's regrettable. Anyway, next question.
Yes, I think the market is a bit different in the railway and the kind of varied in different transportation mode. And so Milan has some questions regarding how is the railway that this is like customer or demand oriented plan, that when it made this logistic plan. And then Milan also had a couple of questions that in the model, the scenario side, what is the input of the parameters? And
okay, well, in this case, regrettably, I've not had any railroad that has been willing to work with me to provide some real numbers. So all the numbers here are just what seem reasonable to me. I come up with the operating plan that's just to see what would happen, and I play with 12 hours or 85% reliability and just see what the impact's going to be. So there's nothing magic here. Again, it's just a simple model, but I think it's intended to demonstrate that what we think we're providing is nowhere near what we actually are providing, and that there are
Roger, could you display that slide in the presentation?
Which one was that?
The one in which you have the sequential processing of the yards.
Oh, the trip plan. How about this one?
Couple more down.
Okay. Oh, actually this one?
Yeah, this one. Good.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Yes.
So again, I made up everything. I made up how many cars originate. I made up how many cars terminate. So effectively, if this has a role at a railroad, it would seem to me, first of all, I'd like to get some real numbers that aren't fishy like this. But the basic idea is, what philosophy should be our philosophy? I mean, if let's stop talking about, we're going to have this new system that's going to demonstrate, that's going to show where the trains are and where the cars are, and every car that's behind schedule and everything. And let's hit what's really relevant, and that is improving the way the yards function. We can do all kinds of stuff to try to avoid yards and so on, but ultimately you're stuck with yards. I was really surprised that in some of the numbers that have come out, that NS, I think, has 3 intermediate switches on average, and CSX is pretty close to the same thing. So if that's the case, there's no way you can have reliable service. So you need to improve the quality of the yard. And I just don't hear anybody, and I'm not talking about putting in anything physical. Is there anything we can do that improves the reliability and cuts down the process time? And that's just not something I ever hear talked about.
Right. So it's a concept, a framework that more of a framework that we actually investigate to see the feasibility or what could be the scenario here to improve the yard operations.
Well, I guess what in my summary, I'd say, we need to start looking at systems that try to improve the process. Cedar AI is a startup company that said, we've got yard masters out there that are retiring. The new ones that we hire are off the street. They don't have the experience. And even if you have an excellent yard master, it is tough for him to keep track of every chess move that he should be making. You have to look at, one of the things that we see, and again, maybe railroads have improved this, but there's a train makeup check
Right.
as the train's ready to depart. So someone has put perhaps cars next to one another that shouldn't be next to one another. The train's ready to go, and now you have to get in there and switch some cars around. Well, if you had a good process that anticipated that, then you could minimize the number of times that happens. You could be looking at what switch moves can I do that would avoid that from happening. So, Cedar AI is, emphasize that OptiSwitch emphasizes that idea, improving on what even an excellent yard master has provide plans, let's say, and certainly better than an average yard master. We get back in the same question about dispatch systems. They don't necessarily have to be better than the best dispatcher, but they should be better than the average, because they bring the average up to better. Wabtec's yard planner is the only system I'm aware of that looks at trains and yards at the same time. What frequently happens is, as I say, the yard guy is looking out for himself, the dispatcher is looking out for himself, and the yard says, "Oh, I'm ready to, I need to clear this track." Well, the train's not ready, the dispatcher's not ready to take it. Oh, okay, well, I'll have a switch engine take it out to the first siding, and I'll park it there, and then you can pick it up later. Well, that may be completely suboptimal for the dispatcher. So anyway, the Wabtec's yard planner is, in my view, the first time that there's an effort to integrate a yard view and a line of road view. And try to plan, at least plan, I'm not gonna say optimize, but at least plan for the impact of one on the other. As I say, railroading is full of conflicting goals. I'm in the yard, I'm trying to run the yard. I'm not the dispatcher, I'm trying to run the trains. And that's as far as they look.
Right. And integrated planning and integrated multi-road. So so I think maybe we have for last question, if we have any. I do see that Devon raised the hand. I'm not sure if Devon, do you still have the question? It's probably already solved.
Well, I talk a lot. I had most everything.
Okay,
Roger,
so
I have oh wait, Davud has his hand back up. Davud,
yeah,
yes, go ahead. You're muted, Davud.
You're muted. Davud, you're muted. So
there we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger, for your presentation and providing very valuable information about railway industry. My question is about We are using a machine learning algorithm for optimizing resource allocating in railway stations, especially freight railway stations. What's your opinion about using machine learning algorithms or a combination of machine learning algorithms and optimization methodologies for increasing the efficiency of the planning of freight operations in the yard of freight stations?
Okay, well, let me, I'll just provide what I think has been a successful approach. So Cedar AI was trying to demonstrate how their OptiSwitch system could improve the performance of the yard. So they made a presentation. They were working with what the railroad considered to be their best yard master. And they got him to compete with what OptiSwitch did. Well, he liked OptiSwitch so much, he quit the railroad and joined Cedar. So my point is that what he did was they set up a sandbox, I think that's the term, where he could create a problem. And then he would get he would solve the problem as best he could. And then the optimization would run. And he would say, oh, I like that, I don't like that, whatever. And the programmer would then address some specific idea that he had. So in terms of developing, what happened was it got so far along that they haven't played that game of one against the other for probably a year, because the system's optimized. The optimal, well, I won't say optimal, the solution from the software, it always proves to be superior to his. So I kind of like the idea, rather than just kind of setting out and saying, here's what I think this model needs to be, get somebody, set it up in a way that he can pose a problem, solve the problem, and then get instant feedback as to whether or not he's doing better or whether the optimization system needs to evolve. Is that a fair answer?
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rogers, and everyone attending the meeting. It is very interesting presentation and also a lot of fruitful discussions. And we are looking forward to seeing everyone for the next Informs RAS webinar.
And let me just say, the next one, I believe, will be another analogic model developed initially at University of Illinois and now University of Texas. And it also touches on yards. In fact, it's yards connecting across a network, so that the impact of one yard has on the other will be demonstrated as well.
Yes.
So I look forward to that.
Right. Okay.
Roger,
so,
thank you. This is really good. I have a thought for you on some of this stuff. I will follow up on later.
Okay, excellent. Well, anybody has any comments, let me know, rwbaugher@gmail.com.
yes, any questions that can also be directed to Rogers or to our RAS communities, and we will address that.